Hello, my name is Joel Garner, and this is my first episode in my new series titled Birth Control, Satan's Greatest Victory Against the Church in the United States. And this episode will be about the Onan incident in Genesis 38, verses 6 to 10. Before I get into reading that passage, I just want to briefly go over why I'm going to name an entire series on this issue, and that is because the use of birth control in our country, which largely began for Christians in the early 20th century, is so destructive that I think one could objectively say there is nothing that has been done to the church worse than us Christians, us Protestant Christians, being deceived into believing that it is okay to use birth control. And I could spend an hour explaining why this is. And this is not the specific episode I want to do that in. But I just wanted to briefly point out that it's because of the massive and extensive destruction to the body of Christ in the U.S. and the spread of the gospel, not just in the U.S., but in the rest of the world from the U.S., that is done by this specific deception from the enemy. And that's why I've named this series that. Now, I'll go ahead and read Genesis 38, 6 to 10, which is what this specific episode is about. And it says, Then Judah took a wife for Er, his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Er, Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord killed him. And Judah said to Onan, Go into your brother's wife and marry her, and raise up an heir to your brother. But Onan knew that the heir would not be his. And it came to pass, when he went into his brother's wife, that he emitted on the ground, lest he should give an heir to his brother. And the thing which he did displeased the Lord. Therefore he killed him also. This particular passage, if you Google it and read articles on it written by Protestant Christians, or watch podcasts on it by Protestant Christians, not Catholics, but Protestants, you will find that 95% of them will say that God struck Onan dead because he would not raise up an heir to his brother according to Judah's command, and that this violates something called the Levirate marriage mentioned in Deuteronomy 25. And that this is the real reason Onan was killed, and not because he used a primitive form of birth control. Okay? That doctrinal viewpoint has only existed for less than 100 years. Prior to the mid-20th century, nobody believed that. There are no Christians teaching that anywhere. And all of the Christians are teaching that Onan's sin was that he used birth control, that God struck Onan dead because he practiced a form of birth control. This is also the viewpoint of Jews. They believe that the passage there, that God's in Genesis 38, 6 to 10, where God struck Onan dead, that it is because Onan used birth control, because he emitted his seed on the ground, like it says in our modern day translations. Okay? That is the viewpoint of Jews all the way up to Christianity. And when Christianity began, the viewpoint of the early church fathers all the way to the mid-20th century. Or you could say a little bit to the early 20th century. their viewpoint is that birth control is an egregious sin, and none of them believed that Onan's primary sin was that he dishonored the Levirate marriage. They didn't believe that. That belief began in the mid-20th century. There was an article written in Christianity Today, which was a very popular magazine at the time. Many evangelical Christians read it. It was heavily dispersed and disseminated in the U.S. And there was an article written by a theologian named John Warwick Montgomery, where he subtly suggested that perhaps Onan's real sin was not that he used birth control, but that he dishonored the Levirate marriage and disobeyed Judah's command. And that this is the real reason that God struck him dead. Okay? So the viewpoint that you will hear stated in 95% of all the people in podcasts and articles online that are evangelical or Protestant Christians is this same viewpoint, that Onan's sin was really that he dishonored the Levirate marriage, not that he used birth control. But prior to the mid-20th century, this theological viewpoint did not exist. From the time that Genesis was written up to the time of Christianity, Jews believed that Onan's sin was that he used birth control, and that this is a serious evil, and that is why God struck him dead. From the time of the early church fathers, just right after the church started, all the way up to the early to mid-20th century, all Christians, all theologians, all pastors, priests, everybody preaching the gospel, all of them, in every single Christian denomination, every single one of them, they believed that Onan's sin was that he used birth control. All of them believe that. With the divorce and remarriage issue, there's a raging debate throughout history that began in the early 4th century. But not so with birth control. With birth control, there is no raging debate. The unanimous viewpoint of all churches everywhere, every single denomination, for 1900 years, is that birth control is an egregious sin, and that's why God struck Onan dead, because he practiced a form of birth control. A lot of Christians today do not realize this. They just assume that the Bible doesn't actually say birth control is wrong. Well, that's not true. There's people saying that, but you have to keep in mind that comes from man. It's not from the Holy Spirit. That's not what the Bible actually says. So, with this particular passage, I'm also going to point out that what John Warwick Montgomery suggested, which was basically like a spark that turned into a raging inferno that basically burnt up the entire church in the U.S. and even in much of the rest of the world as well. That this doctrine is false, and that although he may have suggested that, and it may have been what itching ears wanted to hear, that there is no way that passage could actually mean that, and that the doctrinal viewpoint of Jews from the time of even down to the patriarchs, all the way to the early 20th century, was the correct viewpoint. I mean, after all, how likely is it that the theology that was invented in the mid-20th century is correct, and what was probably more than 3,000 years of theology on Genesis 38, 6-10 was incorrect? You know, that's not likely to be the case. Common sense should dictate it's more likely that the recent change in theology is heresy and is not the true interpretation. And for people who do not analyze this passage carefully, and they just listen to what other people say. After all, that's 95% of what you're going to hear from other Protestant Christians online. They just assume that that's how it is. Maybe people in the past didn't really understand that, or maybe they didn't use birth control because they were ignorant and didn't know about it. This is all false. The fact of the matter is that every major civilization in the history of the world regularly used birth control, with 2 exceptions. And we know this because of extensive historical writings on this subject. And also there's a substantial amount of archaeological evidence that shows this as well. Birth control is not a 20th century phenomenon. Birth control may be perfected in the 20th century, but it exists and was heavily used by most people prior to that, with the exception of 2 types of civilizations, one of which is Jewish civilizations. They, of course, believed it was wrong because of Genesis 38:6-10, and Christian civilizations that also believed it was wrong based on Genesis 38:6-10. Okay? So I'm going to now go over this passage and point out why there's no way that Onan's primary sin that God killed him dead for could have been dishonoring the levirate marriage. This passage says that Onan knew the heir would not be his, and it came to pass when he went into his brother's wife that he emitted on the ground, lest he should give an heir to his brother. Okay, that's describing Onan's motive, why he used birth control. It's not the thing that displeased the Lord. And by the way, this displeased the Lord, in the New King James, it has a footnote. And it reads, literally, was evil in the eyes of. In other words, what it literally says in the Hebrew is what Onan did was evil in God's eyes. That's what it says. In other words, it's an extreme evil, and that's exactly how Christians and Jews interpreted this before. This business of this violating a levirate marriage, well, the problem is that the levirate marriage did not exist in the time of Er and Onan and Judah. There was no levirate marriage. The levirate marriage was written by Moses later on, and it's in Deuteronomy 25, which I will go to shortly. And Deuteronomy 25 is near the end of Moses' life. So Moses did not seem to think it was important enough to write law about this levirate marriage till he was near dead. He was near death when he wrote that. He had been with the children of Israel more likely for 35 plus years prior to that, and never wrote anything about that, except you could say he wrote Genesis 38:6-10. However, Genesis 38:6-10 undoubtedly existed before Moses wrote it, and Moses just incorporated it into the book of Genesis from other sources. So it already existed then, and yet there's no levirate marriage. This is not stated as a commandment from the Lord. This is stated as a commandment from Judah to his son. The fact that Judah would say this to his son suggests that this custom existed. It existed as a custom, but not as a commandment from God. So Onan disobeyed Judah, but he didn't violate the levirate marriage because the levirate marriage didn't exist. Didn't exist at that time. Isn't that rather peculiar that God would strike someone dead for violating a custom or a tradition that his father ordered him to do, rather than a commandment from God? That doesn't make a lot of sense. The fact of the matter is that God did command not to use birth control prior to this. And that command would be in Genesis chapter 1, where it says in beginning in verse 26, then God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. Then God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. Okay. So God commanded man, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Okay. Two people cannot fill the earth with offspring. That's impossible. So we know that this command is not merely to Adam and Eve only. You know, some people who would not like to acknowledge that this is a command to make children, which would also, by inference, be a command not to use birth control to impede that. You know, some of the people who believe that would not want to recognize that this is a commandment for mankind going forward. But the fact of the matter is it was. This is the first command from God in the Bible to mankind. And we would be wise not to trivialize it. You know, I once heard a pastor talk about this and he laughed at it. He mocked that passage and didn't think we had to do that. But this is God's word. It's the first commandment that God gave to mankind. The first one. He could have given any command, and he chose to give this one because obviously it's important to God. It's not intuitive for people to want to have children. A lot of times they don't. That's why birth control is so popular in the U.S. right now. And we have to say no to our flesh and obey God's command to be fruitful and multiply anyways. So what does that mean to be fruitful and multiply? Okay, we know that in the Bible that there is it says that God opens the womb and God closes the womb, which it actually doesn't literally say. What it does, it has many passages and stories that clearly indicate this to be the case. So God's closing the womb and opening the womb means that we are not responsible for having a certain amount of children to fulfill God's mandate to be fruitful and multiply. Instead, we are responsible to have sexual relations with our spouse, the person we're married to, and not use any birth control, not do anything that would interrupt conception. That's what be fruitful and multiply means. It means husbands and wives have to have sex. They have to have sex with each other, and part of that sex is no obstruction to conception. I mean, if you are a Christian who really wants to do what God says in His Word, even when other Christians around you don't agree and they even mock things like this, okay, then what I'm saying will resonate in your spirit, because this is exactly what God's Word actually says, and the objective is to understand God's commands and to obey them. So if that's really your heart's desire, then you should be receptive to what's being said. Just because you didn't hear it preached like this for the past 20, 30, 40 years doesn't mean that it's false. All that matters is what God really said in His Word. That's what He's going to judge us by when we die. Not whether we heard it in a sermon from our pastor or not. So, this business of being fruitful and multiplying, Onan knew about this. He knew that he was supposed to be fruitful and multiply. He may very well have gotten the concept of using birth control from his Canaanite side of the family, because his mother was a Canaanite. It's possible. But Onan, being the son of Judah, And Judah, having Genesis 1 already written, he would have known about it. He would have known that God prohibited the use of birth control, and that husbands and wives are supposed to have sex with each other with no birth control being used. He knew this, and he consciously chose to disobey that command. Even though God had given few commands to mankind up to that point in history. And that is why it is such a serious sin. You know, when God only gives you a few commands and you don't do those few commands, it's very serious to God. And that's what was taking place here. So, Onan sinned knowingly. He sinned and disobeyed God's command, and he knew he did it, and God struck him dead for it. Now, I'm going to address this levirate marriage theory, because that's all it is. I mean, there's no mention of the levirate marriage in this passage, quite frankly. That's just reading it into the text. Clearly, there's some sort of custom along these lines that existed in Judah and Onan's time, but there was no levirate marriage written until Deuteronomy 25, which is near the end of Moses' life. We're going to go there now. And it begins in verse 5. So it's Deuteronomy 25, verse 5. If brothers dwell together, and one of them dies and has no son, the widow of the dead man shall not be married to a stranger outside the family. Her husband's brother shall go into her, take her as wife, and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And it shall be that the firstborn son which she bears will succeed to the name of his dead brother, and his name may not be blotted out of Israel. But if the man does not want to take his brother's wife, then let his brother's wife go up to the gate to the elders and say, my husband's brother refuses to raise up a name to his brother in Israel. He will not perform the duty of my husband's brother. Then the elders of his city shall call him and speak to him. But if he stands firm and says, I do not want to take her, then his brother's wife shall come to him in the presence of the elders, remove his sandal from his foot, spit in his face, and answer and say, so shall it be done to the man who will not build up his brother's house. And his name shall be called in Israel, the house of him who had his sandal removed. A few translations call this, he shall be called the unshod. So that's his penalty. Sister-in-law spits in his face, removes his shoe, and he gets to be called the unshod. The truth of the matter is that this penalty here is trivial. So the penalty for not honoring the levirate marriage, when Moses codified it, put it into law, basically as a commandment from God, which had not happened yet in Genesis 38. The penalty for that is shoe removed, spit in face, and being called the unshod. And in fact, if you read that passage carefully, you realize that he really didn't have to marry her. He's commanded to marry. It says, if brothers dwell together and one of them dies and has no son, the widow of the dead man shall not be married to a stranger outside of the family. Her husband's brother shall go into her, take her as wife, and perform the duty of her husband's brother to her. Okay? So, it says outside the family too, and if you look at the book of Ruth, you'll see that the closest relative was expected to marry Ruth and didn't want to do it. And so then Boaz got to marry her. Well, the type of penalty there is minor. Okay, so even if you view that passage like, no, the man absolutely has to marry his dead brother's wife. Like, for example, even if he's already married, he has to do it anyways. Okay, even if you view that as, well, that's a very serious command from God, the penalty for it is trivial. He's not flogged, he's not fined, he's not put to death. It's sister-in-law gets to spit in your face, take your shoe off, and people call you the unshod. Okay, why If that is the penalty for violating the Levirate marriage, would God strike Onan dead for essentially committing that same sin? I mean, that's ridiculous. That doesn't make any logical sense. If it was a serious offense in Onan's time before it was even codified as law from the Lord, then why would it be a trivial offense later on when it's codified by law and you're actually commanded to do it, not just Judah commanding his son to do it? It makes no logical sense whatsoever. You see, this theory is frivolous. It doesn't work when you carefully examine this passage. Other things that are worth noting here, going back to Genesis 38, it says in verse 9, "But Onan knew that the heir would not be his, and it came to pass, when he went into his brother's wife, that he emitted on the ground, lest he should give an heir to his brother." Okay. In Hebrew, that word emitted does not exist. It does not say in the original language that this was written in that Onan emitted on the ground. That's just how we translate it into English. The Hebrew word there, translated as emitted, does not mean emitted anywhere else in the Bible. What it means is, and this word is, it's called sahat or shachath or shakath. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it. It's apparently spelled different ways because that's just a transliteration of it. And I'm going to read what this is just Google AI that came up with this, and I looked at some other definitions of this word, but I thought that they summarized it pretty good, so I'm going to go with theirs. It says the Hebrew word shachath is a verb primarily meaning to destroy, ruin, corrupt, or spoil. It appears frequently in the Old Testament to describe physical destruction, moral depravity, or decay, often used in context of spoiling or wasting. It can also mean to act corruptly or to cause ruin. Okay? So what is literally being said in the Hebrew is that Onan destroyed, ruined, and corrupted, spoiled his seed on the ground. And the usage of that verb normally is used to describe something very sinful. So in the Hebrew, the emphasis is not on Onan violating Judah's command to go into his brother's wife. The emphasis is on the act of him destroying his seed on the ground. And that's why Jews have no problem reading this passage and understanding that, because it's abundantly clear in the Hebrew that that's what the central issue is. That may not translate as well into English, and so we don't quite realize that, but the Bible wasn't inspired in English, it was inspired in Hebrew. And in the Hebrew, there's heavy emphasis on the wrongness of the physical act that Onan did. So if that's the case, why would it be that he just dishonored the Levirate marriage? And why would you even have to have a Levirate marriage anyways? I mean, if birth control is okay, why would you have to raise up a heir to your dead brother's wife? Why would you not just be able to marry her and then just decide to use birth control if birth control is okay? Why would it only be sinful to use birth control when you marry your dead brother's wife? I think it's a bit of a stretch to argue that theologically. I think it actually is pretty obviously implied that if you're expected to marry your dead brother's wife and expected that the firstborn son would then take your dead brother's place as far as inheritance goes, then that would be because you normally have to be fruitful and multiply anyways. So it's just a joke. I mean, what happened in the mid-20th century is super flimsy theology. It's a house of cards. You know, it collapses once you examine the situation carefully, and there's really no reason to look at that like that's how things really are. I mean, after all, for over 3,000 years, I mean, virtually no one believed that Onan's, principal sin was that he disobeyed Judah's command. They believed that Onan's principal sin was that he used earth control. So we would be wise as Christians living in the 21st century to not disregard 3,000 years of consistent interpretation and instead take the viewpoint of some theologian who apparently has a little bit of liberal views in the mid-20th century without even carefully examining whether what he's saying could even be true. We shouldn't take that at face value and accept that and reject 3,000 years of interpretation, or even just, you could say, the plain meaning of the text just simply doesn't allow for that interpretation. So I think I will stop this episode here.